Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial. So today what I'm going to be showing you is how you can build your very own REST API using Node.js and the package Express. So what we're going to be creating is a counter API that anyone can access to create a new counter, to get its current value, to change the current value, and also to delete the counter. So in other words, it's going to be able to handle HTTP requests of type GET, POST, PUT, and DELETE. So here in app.js, I'm already importing Express, also cause a package for Express, which is going to allow me to accept requests to this API from any IP, and also the native file system module so that I can interact with the file system. And inside the REST API folder, inside a folder data, and inside their counters, there is a test.json file. So I've hard-coded this particular counter, but you'll see in a few moments when we create the post endpoint for the API that a new counter is created every time a post request comes into our API. So this folder will be populated with lots of .json files, each one its own counter. So that's it for the folder structure of our API. What I still need to do here is to install the packages that are not native to nodes. So that's going to be Express and cause. So from the command line, I'm going to cd into my project folder on my desktop, which is REST API. And then inside there, I'm going to create a new node project, accepting all of the defaults for a new project. So that's npm init /y to accept the defaults. And then I'm going to install Express and cause with npm I express cause. So if we go back to our project folder, you now see there's a package.json file which was created with the new node project and listed as dependencies here for the new project are cause and express. So we can now start using them in app.js. So to create a new Express app using the library that we've imported, you simply call Express, and the return value is going to be your new app. So our Express app is now saved under the reference of app. Now to make some settings that apply globally throughout your app, what you can do is call use on the app you've created, and inside here you can specify something. So in this case, I'm going to be calling the cause library that we imported. So what this is going to do is to allow requests to this server from any IP address, which makes sense because we want anyone to be able to access this API to create counters. So what I'm going to be doing now is creating the get, post, put, and delete endpoints so that requests can be made to this server. So to create a get endpoint, you call app.get, and the first argument is the root for that endpoint. So it's relative to the root for your API. So we're going to be running this locally on a localhost port. So I'm going to make it whatever that port is, /API. So we'll be setting the port number after we've created all of the endpoints. Now the second argument is a callback function in which you have available to you a rec object which has information about the incoming request, and a res object which allows you to construct a response. Now in order to check that this endpoint is working before I construct a proper response inside this callback function, I'm just going to log a message to the console saying HTTP GET request received. And I'm going to do the same for the other endpoint types. So to create a post endpoint, you call app.post. I'm going to have it at the same root as the get endpoint, but of course I want to change the message here. To create a put endpoint, you call app.put, and I'll change the message again. And finally, to create a delete endpoint, you call app.delete, and again, change the message. And now to get the app up and running, you call app.listen, specifying as a first argument the port number on which you want the app to run. So it's going to be running on this machine, so localhost, and I want it to run on port 3000. And then the second argument which is optional, is a callback function. So it's very common in here to specify that the app is now up and running and the port number that it is listening on. So in this case, I've set it to run on port 3000. If when you run your app, you find that something is already listening on port 3000, then try the ports just above it because they are usually free. So let's start the app now and test the endpoints. So I'm going to save app.js and then inside of the project folder, run node app, and it's giving me the message here that the app is listening on port 3000. So this means that I can start making requests to the server from the front end. So in index.html here, I'm making a HTTP request to localhost port 3000/API of type get. So if I run the HTML file here, that contains the script making the fetch request. So we're not actually getting anything back from the server in this case, but on the server side, you see that the message HTTP GET request received has been logged to the console. Now, if I change the type of request I'm making to post, and that's going to automatically refresh because I'm using live server, now you see post request received. So what this means is that for each of the callback functions inside the endpoints in app.js, we can differentiate the response based on the type of incoming request, whether it's a get, post, put, or delete request. And what we're going to do now, instead of just logging a message to the console each time, is to construct a response for each endpoint based upon the reading and writing of file data. So what I'm going to do for this get endpoint is to read the contents of test.json and return the value of the count to the user. So we can do that by calling fs.readFile. So this is on the native file system module that we have already imported. The first argument is the file name, including the path to the file. So that is located in data counters /test.json is the file name. So usually for text-based files, the encoding is UTF-8. And the third argument is a callback function in which you have available to you two parameters. If there's an error, then there will be something in this error reference. If not, then the data will be available under the reference data. So the first thing that you want to do here is to check if there was an error when reading the file. So if so, there will be something inside error, and this if block will run. So if there was an error, then I'm going to set a status code of 500 for the response. So this is an error status code, and then as the response itself, I'm going to return a JSON string letting the user know that there was an error reading the file. So all I'm going to do for a successful response is just send the data back to the user, which is already in JSON format. So I'll set a status code for a successful response to 200, and then I'm going to use res.send here. So this is just going to send whatever I pass into it in the format it currently is, which is JSON. So if successful, the user is going to get back the data for test.json in JSON format. So let's test this out now. In index.html, I'm going to make a GET request to the server, and I also want to handle the response. So it's going to be in JSON format. You can use res.json to convert that JSON payload to a JavaScript object, and then I'm going to log the data that has been converted to the console. So I'll save index.html now, and I'm going to restart the server. So a new request will be made to the server when I refresh this page in the browser. And if we have a look at what we're getting back as a JavaScript object the data that was inside test.json. So this data is coming back from a hard-coded JSON file, but what I want for this API is somebody using it to be able to make a post request to the server, and it's going to dynamically create a new counter that they can then access. So let's go back to app.js and start coding the response for a post request. So the first thing that I'm going to do in response to a post request is to create an ID for the new counter that I'm going to be creating. So if you're running a later version of Node, then you will have available to you the random UUID method. But to be on the safe side, because this method is fairly new, I'm going to import a package so we know that functionality is definitely there. So I'm going to install UUID, which is available via npm. So I'll go into the command line, stop the server, Control-C, and install UUID. Once this is done, then you'll be able to create a new UUID using this syntax. So first of all, you want to import it using require. So I'll place that at the top of the script. And then you just call this function and it's going to generate an ID that looks a little bit like this. So instead of crypto random UUID, I call the function for creating an ID using that library. Next, I'm going to create the data for the counter itself. So we saw what this looks like. It has a count property and the starting value is going to be 0. And now what I'm going to do is to store this new counter as a JSON file inside the data counters folder. So for this, you can call fs.writefile. The first argument is the file name, including the path. So in this case, it's going to be data/counters. Then I'm going to save the file as the ID that I created for this counter.json. Next is the data to write itself. So I want to stringify here the counter object so that it's in JSON format when it's written to file. And if you don't want to overwrite any existing file, then you can include this object in which the flag property is set to WX. And then finally, a callback function here in which you have available to you an error parameter that you want to check to see if there was an error writing the file. So we're doing the same thing that we were before when we were reading test.json. So if there was an error writing the file, then you want to send back an error status code, and the response itself I'm going to send back as a string in JSON format saying that there was an error in creating the counter. Now, if it was successful, then I'm going to set the status code for the response to a success code, and again, send a message to the user as a string in JSON format. And in this message, I'm going to let the user know that a new counter was created and also the ID for that counter. So the user will be able to use this ID as a reference to make future requests to the server to do things with the counter, such as get its value, increment it by 1, update its value, and also to delete the counter. Let's check that this post response is working before we create the other routes. So in index.html, I'm going to want to make a post request this time. I'm going to restart the server. Then when I refresh in the browser, we are now getting the expected result. So we're getting an ID back for the new counter that has been created. And if we take a look inside the data counters folder, you can see that this new file has been created with a counter set to 0. So from now on, this is how we're going to be creating new counters from a post request that is coming in from a user of the API and not hard coding it like we did with test.json. And you'll see if I make a couple more post requests that it will create new counters with their own unique ID. So there's some new counters, but at present, there's no way to increase the counters by 1 or to get the current value of a counter via the API. So let's code that now. And what I'm going to do is to modify the get endpoint that we created previously. So let's modify this now. So it's not just reading test.json, but one of the counters that we have created based upon the input of the user making the request. So we can do that by making the path for this endpoint dynamic. So the new path is going to be /API / and then colon, and then the name of whatever it is that you're going to be accepting. So in this case, it's going to be accepting a user ID, and then here we're going to set the file to be read to request.params, and then the property name on here is going to be whatever you assigned after the colon. So this can be whatever you want. In this case, it makes sense to call it user ID. So let's test this out now. I'm going to copy the ID for the last counter that I created. And after saving app.js, of course, inside index.html, I'm going to make a GET request, and it's going to be to API / and then I paste the ID for the counter. So let's check whether this is working now. I'll restart my app. Now, if I refresh index.html, I'm getting back the count of the counter, so this would be correct. It's starting at the value of 0. And now let's test entering a non-valid ID. So I'll copy the one that was working just to make a note of it. I'll do that in a comment just here. So 123, there's no counter 123.json. If I refresh here, we're getting the error reading file message. And in fact, because the user is requesting a specific resource now that doesn't exist, you may want to change the error to a 404, and the message to the user can be no counter with ID, and then enter here the ID that the user has given on rec params. So we've now got a post endpoint for creating a counter, a get endpoint for getting the current value of a counter with a given ID. What we're going to code next is another get endpoint that is going to increment the value of the counter by 1. So I'm actually just going to copy the code for this endpoint here and create another one. And after ID, if the user includes increment in the path, then it's going to increment the value of the counter with the user entered ID by 1. So instead of just sending back the JSON data from the file read, what I'm going to do is to first of all convert the JSON object to a JavaScript object. So I can do that by passing it in to json.parse. And I'm going to set the value of the count property on the object to the current value of object.count plus 1. And now using fs.writeFile, I'm going to write the new data to disk, overwriting the JSON for the original count with the updated one. So as you saw before, the first argument is the file name and path. So file name is going to be dynamically inserted here, and that's going to be the value of rec.params.user ID. The second argument is the data itself, so I'm going to use json.stringify, passing in the JavaScript object. I'm not going to include the options object here with the flag property because I actually want to overwrite the existing file. And then, as you saw in previous examples, we have an error object which we should first check. So if there is an error, then we're going to want to set a status code for the response to an error status code, and the response itself I'll set as a JSON string where I say error updating counter, and then below, if it was successful, then I want to set a status code to a success code, and I'm going to return to the user as JSON the updated count. So I can do that by passing a JavaScript object into res.json. So let's test this out now. In index.html, I'm going to change the request. So I want to use the valid ID that I was using before, / increment, and I'll restart the server and make a request by refreshing the browser. So if I open the console, I'm getting an object back now with a count of 1. And if I refresh, see that the counter is now updating every time a request is made to that endpoint. Now, something that a user of this API might want to do is to update the value of count to reset the counter, or to start it at a value that is greater than 0. So we're going to be making that possible by coding a put endpoint. So I'm going to toggle the display of the endpoints that we have already, because there's quite a lot of information there. So for the put endpoint, the user is going to be updating a counter with a specific ID. So again, the endpoint here is going to be dynamic, and I'll set the variable on params to the same name. So when a put request comes in, I'm going to attempt to read the file that the user has specified. So I'll do that using read file, and in doing this, I'm also checking whether the file exists. So I'm going to be using the same trick as before to get the ID of the counter. It's available on rec.params.user_id. The encoding will be UTF-8, and then comes the callback function, in which I have the error, if there is one, and also the data that I have read. So for the error handling, check the error first. If there is one, send an error code. So in this case, I'll send 500, and then I'm going to return to the user as a JSON string, a message saying counter with ID, and then enter that dynamically again. So counter with ID, the value of recparams.userid does not exist. Now, if that JSON file does exist with the counter data, then the first thing I'm going to want to do here is to convert it from JSON to a JavaScript object. So I can do that by passing the data that I've read into json.parse, and I'm going to want to update the count property on that object to the value that the user specifies. So the user is going to be doing that by including a JSON payload when they make the request, and I'm going to extract from that payload the value for the property new count. Now, the final step for the put request is to overwrite the existing JSON data for the updated counter with the new data. So again, I'm going to be calling fs.writeFile. So I'm going to be overwriting the file that I just read. So same path. The second argument is the data. So that's going to be a JSON version of the JavaScript object with the updated count. I'm not including the options object on here because I actually want the JSON file to be overwritten, and I have available here the error. So the error handling from the read file, I'm just going to copy here, but we want to change the message this time to failed to update counter. And if it was successful, then set a success status code. So I'll set that to 200. And what I'm going to return to the user is the updated data. So by passing the JavaScript object into res.json, that's going to convert it to JSON for me. So that's what the user is going to get back from their request. So let's set the request now, because we need to make some changes. So it's going to be a put request. Also, I can delete increment from here, but it is still API/a valid ID. Now for the payload, I set a body property, and I'm going to call JSON.stringify. So it converts to JSON the JavaScript object that I define inside it. So it needs to have a property new count, and I'm going to set the value of the count to 99. And you might find that the data isn't intercepted properly if you don't include a content type header on the request. So I'll set that now. So it's JSON, and I'm setting content type to application/JSON. So let's see if this put endpoint is working now. I'm going to restart the app, and then save index.html. Then a request is going to be made. I just refreshed, and we're getting back an object with a count of 99. So that's what we expected. And if we take a look at that JSON file in the folder, you see that the count has indeed been updated to 99 for the counter with an ID starting 297. So that is the one we requested here. So the final endpoint to code for this API is the delete endpoint. So again, it's going to be a dynamic endpoint because the user is requesting to delete a counter with a specific ID. So when a delete request comes in, we can call fs unlink. So this is what you use to delete a file from the system. So it's located in data/counters, and then the file name is the ID that the user has given, .json. So that is again available on rec.params.counterid. And now for the second argument, we're straight in to the callback function and error handling. So if there's an error, then we want to check for it. So if there was a problem deleting the file specified by the user, then I'm going to return a status code of 500. And in the response, I'm going to say no count with ID, and then again enter the ID there, found. So I can just copy here rec.params.counterid, and if it was successful, then I'll send a success code and also a message to the user as a JSON string. So I'll say count with ID, and then enter the ID there, was deleted. Okay, so let's test out the delete endpoint now. So in the request, it's going to be a delete request, and I'm going to get rid of the headers and the body from the request. I'll just comment those out. So the endpoint is correct. It's /API /a valid ID there. So I will save this index.html file, restart the server, and now I'll refresh and we'll see what we get back. So we're getting that success message back. And if I take a look at the data inside counters, one is now missing, and it's this one up here that has now been deleted. So finally, let's test the endpoint one more time from the beginning. So I'm going to create a new counter. I do that with a post request. I don't have to send anything along with it, and I'm not specifying an ID for a new counter. That will be created for me. So I'll send off this request. So it's telling me that a new counter has been created, and I'll take note of its ID. Now to get the current value of the counter, which will start at 0, I make a GET request, entering the ID after API, so /a valid ID. And then I get back the current count, which is indeed 0. To increment the counter, I can make a request to what I was before, /increment. It's a GET request again, and this is going to increase the counter value by 1. If I want to update the value of the counter, then that is a put request. So I'll uncomment this, and I'll set the value of the counter to 0 again, and remove this /increment from the endpoint I'm making the request to. So now we're getting back the counter, which has been set to a value of 0. And finally, to delete the counter, all you need to do is to make a delete request at the same endpoint. So it's now letting me know that that was deleted. And now, as you can see in the counters folder, there is no JSON file starting with 536. So we've successfully deleted the file there. So that is it for this tutorial on how you can create your very own REST API using Node and Express. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please consider hitting the like button down below this video. It helps with the algorithm and others to find this video. And if you'd like to see more content like this from us in the future, don't forget you can subscribe to the channel.